Hello, and welcome to Dissecting Philosophy with Dr. McDonald. In this episode, I'll be reading and discussing the section The Three Evils in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So let's get started. Of the Three Evil Things. Section 1. In a dream, in my last morning dream, I stood today upon a headland, beyond the world. I held a pair of scales and weighed the world. Oh, that the dawn came to me too soon. It glowed me into wakefulness, the jealous dawn. It is always jealous of the glow of my morning dreams. Measurable to him who has time, weighable to a good weigher, accessible to strong opinions, divinable to divine nutcrackers. Thus did my dream find the world. My dream, a bold sailor, half ship, half hurricane, silent as a butterfly, impatient as a falcon. How did it have time and patience today for weighing of worlds? Did my wisdom perhaps speak secretly to it, my laughing, wakeful day wisdom that mocks all infinite worlds? For my wisdom says, where power is, there number becomes master. It has more power. How confidently did my dream gaze upon this finite world, eager neither for new things nor for old, neither in awe nor in supplication. As if a round apple presented itself to my hand, a ripe, golden apple with a soft, cool, velvety skin. Thus the world presented itself to me. As if a tree nodded to me, a wide-branching, strong-willed tree, bent for reclining and as a footstool for the way-weary. Thus the world stood upon my headland. As if tender hands brought me a casket open for the delight of modest, adoring eyes. Thus the world presented himself before me today. Not so enigmatic as to frighten away human love, not so explicit as to put to sleep human wisdom. A good, human thing was the world to me today, this world of which so many evil things are said. How grateful I am to my morning dream, that today in the early morning I thus weighed the world. It came to me as a good, human thing, this dream and comforter of the heart, and that I may do the same as it is by day, and learn and imitate its best aspects. I will now place the three most evil things upon the scales and weigh them well and humanly. He who is taught how to bless also taught how to curse. Which are the three most cursed things in the world? I will place these upon the scales: sensual pleasure, lust for power, selfishness. These three have hitherto been cursed the most, and held in the worst and most unjust repute. These three will I weigh well and humanely. Well then, here is my headland, and there is the sea. It rolls towards me, shaggy, fawning, the faithful old 100-headed canine monster that I love. Well then, here I will hold the scales over the rolling sea, and I choose a witness too, to look on you, hermit tree, you, heavy-odored, broad-arched tree that I love. Upon what bridge does the present go over to the hereafter? What compulsion compels the high to bend to the low? And what bids even the highest to grow higher still? Now the scales stand level and still. I have thrown in 3 weighty questions. The other scale bears 3 weighty answers. So, starting the section, we have Zarathustra describe this dream that he's had to us. And in this dream, he's holding a pair of scales and is looking at the world. And so, from a religious point, or at least from a organized religious viewpoint, there's this sort of agreed upon general argument that the world in the here and now is something we don't really need to focus our time upon. What we need to focus upon is rather our actions, and in doing so, we become a much better, well-rounded individual. And therefore, once we've committed all the good actions in our life, therefore, we're going to be focused upon the thing that is important, which is our soul and in the afterlife. And so when we go into this whole idea of Zarathustra weighing the world, he then says, well, it's a good thing for us. And it's precisely a good human thing was the world to me today, which is then an immediate criticism straight against any sort of religious or spiritual argument that's going to precisely focus on the afterlife. Because what Nietzsche wants us to think upon, is all the very positive things about the world. And we can get quite a lot out of the little sentence, not so enigmatic as to frighten away human love, not so explicit as to put to sleep human wisdom. And it's the whole idea there that once you give love to the world, let's say in a farming context, and we're planting our seeds and so forth, and putting all that work and effort in, what we're going to get from all that is, of course, all the benefits of having to therefore then reap what you sow, and all the benefits of all the food from all that. And they're in relation to human wisdom. The more that we learn about the world, the more that we engage with the world and understand how it works and so forth, is all an incredible amount of benefit to us. So it both gives to us in a very loving manner, as well as helps us develop our own knowledge at the same time. And quite interestingly, there's a really nice connection to Spinoza here, where Nietzsche's sharing the same sentiment that Spinoza does when dealing with the world or nature. And that is to say that we can't explicitly say one thing is absolutely good or another thing is absolutely evil, because it all depends upon the specific human context in which it's viewed. And so it all depends upon the specific person and their outlook. And a nice example of that, of course, is that two people will disagree upon a piece of music. One person will like it and another person won't. And so when you then apply that same thinking to the world itself, and you go to natural events and natural disasters and so on, we can say, well, of course that's a horrible event, but we can't explicitly say the world is to blame for this occurring, therefore the world is an evil thing. We have to say it's a horrible thing that's happened in this specific context, and why do we understand it as a horrible thing is because it's affected us and other people. And so what is also quite interesting then is to move away from the ideas of absolutes for good and evil at the same time here, to rather than go into the analysis of specific contexts, of trying to therefore ask the questions of, well, why is this thing viewed as good in this specific context? Or why is it viewed as evil in this specific context? And trying to understand the specific conditions and reasonings behind people's viewpoints. But then we come back to the idea of the scales, in Zarathustra in his dream, and we can just say, well, weighing the world itself is pretty neutral. Yes, there's horrible things that happen in the world, like natural disasters and so on, but we can't ultimately say as a whole the world is absolutely, completely pure evil just because these natural disasters and events occur. So then we're going to have Nietzsche be critical of what people have then said about sensual pleasure, lusting for power, and selfishness in the next section. So continuing on then, section 2, sensual pleasure, goad and stake to all hair-shirted despisers of the body and anathematized as the world by all afterworldsmen, for it mocks and makes fools of all teachers of confusion and error. Sensual pleasure, to the rabble the slow fire over which they are roasted, to all worm-eaten wood, to all stinking tatters, the ever-ready stewing oven of lust. Sensual pleasure, innocent and free, to free hearts, the earth's garden joy, an overflowing of thanks to the present from all the future. Sensual pleasure, a sweet poison only to the withered, but to the line-willed, the great restorative, and reverently preserved wine of wines. Sensual pleasure, the great symbolic happiness of a higher happiness and highest hope. For marriage is promised to many, and more than marriage. To many that are stranger to one another than man and woman, and who has fully conceived how strange man and woman are to one another. Sensual pleasure, but I will fence my thoughts round, and my words too, so that swine and hot fanatics shall not break into my garden. So for sensual pleasure then, we have Nietzsche immediately say, who are the people that are critical of those who take pleasure in sex? Is those people that he says are despisers of the body? Who are those people? The afterworlds men, as he also calls them. And what is all this getting towards the point again of going to the whole approach of the afterlife and the soul, and therefore keeping your soul pure. And what is one of the main ways in which your soul is meant to be impure is indulging within our bodily desires. And a good example of that is to go back to Plato and to go to the whole discussion in Phaedo, where we have Socrates discuss what's the good ethical things for us to do is abstain from all bodily desire. Why is that the case? Because the more that we indulge, the more that the soul is riveted to the body and becomes more bodily, and so we're not therefore able to achieve the best form of the afterlife possible, when our whole aim in life should be to adhere to this whole ethical model of abstinence from desire, and therefore make your soul pure, because then you're able to achieve the best form of the afterlife. So then we have this whole critical approach to say, well, these are the type of people who are going to be critical of sex and sensual pleasure. And of course, a great modern example of all this is through the very extreme contemporary religious approach, in which people argue out and out just for straight abstinence completely, and trying to argue for abstinence, especially in teenagers. Then they have that whole idea of purity rings, and therefore having this whole idea sense of a purity ring is something like a badge of honor, and it's such a great thing that everybody is able to be abstinent, because it goes then back into the whole idea of giving yourself to another person that you love, and that should be the person that you're married to. and not to just run around and have promiscuous sex because you'll live to regret all that. And is Nietzsche arguing for complete promiscuity as a refuting this argument? Absolutely not. In fact, it's quite the funny and humorous image here when he says, you have the rabble like a slow fire over which they're roasted, like an ever-ready stewing oven of lust. It's such a fantastic image there. Everybody running around very lustful and wanton sex. So it's not that Nietzsche's arguing for promiscuity here. It's rather to say, well, the actual act of sex is very pleasurable and enjoyable, and it's not something that's in any way negative for us. Because as he says here as well, we have that whole idea of being lion-willed, as he says, that fantastic image of the lion coming back in again, and therefore being a great restorative and rejuvenative thing for us. And at the same time, we have the whole scientific aspect of it all coming out as well. Well, why does anyone have sex to begin with? Is for procreation and for the species to continue on. And we also have that come out of the lines of the great symbolic happiness of a higher happiness and highest hope, as well as an ever-flowing of thanks to the present from all the future. Is always that whole sense of, well, we have precisely all the joy we have from children, and if only in a kind of strange way that our children could therefore go back and thank that whole procreative act, they would. And Nietzsche is critical of marriage here in the sense of, well, when people get married together, you always think to yourself, well, it's two virgins who've romantically saved each other for themselves, and having that whole romantic idea of, well, they're going to only be the ever people in the entire life they're going to ever have had sex with. But it's sort of that Nietzsche line that slipped in there of how strange man and woman is to one another. And this goes into that whole idea, wow, maybe the marriage isn't going to work. In fact, divorce is very much a thing. People fall out of love with each other all the time. And therefore, what we can be critical of here is within that very idea of abstinence in the very extreme way that can be argued for, is to very much say, well, what you're arguing for is an incredibly idealistic idea of precisely what love is. Wouldn't that all be wonderful? Probably, but would it actually work out? More than likely, there's all the percentage chances and so forth would say no, because any number of things can happen and people just fall out of love with each other over time. And so marriage isn't this sort of sacred institution that will guarantee that two people will always love each other. So we have quite a number of things that Nietzsche is saying in this wee section on sensual pleasure. We have, of course, the whole aspect of, well, isn't that what desire within us wants in the first place? Procreation. We can see all that at work through the way in which everybody is promiscuous. And then we also have the positive aspects on our mental health. It's a great rejuvenative thing for us, as well as that whole critical aspect about marriage there as well, about this not being in any given way a pure institution that's going to guarantee love. Next, moving on to lust for power. So let's continue on. Lust for power, the scourge of fire of the hardest hearted, the cruel torment reserved by the cruelest for himself, the dark flame of living bonfires. Lust for power, the wicked fly seated upon the vainest peoples, the mocker of all uncertain virtue, which rides upon every horse and every pride. Lust for power, the earthquake that breaks and bursts open all that is decayed and hollow, the rolling, growling, punitive destroyer of whitewashed sepulchres, the flashing question mark beside premature answers. Lust for power. Before its glance, man crawls and bends and toils and becomes lower than the swine or the snake, until at last the cry of the great contempt bursts from him. Lust for power, the fearsome teacher of the great contempt, who preaches in the face of cities and empires, "Away with you," until at last they themselves cry out, "Away with me." Lust for power, which, however, rises enticingly even to the pure and the solitary, and up to the self-sufficient heights, glowing like a love that paints purple delights enticingly on earthly heavens. Lust for power, but who shall call it lust when the height longs to stoop down after power? Truly, there is no sickness and lust in such a longing and descent, that the lonely height may not always be solitary and sufficient to itself, that the mountain may descend to the valley, and the wind of the heights to the lowlands. So then, lust for power, we could also say a drive for success in a way, and we then have the whole aspect again of, well, why is this seen to be such a critical thing? Who are the people that raise this up is an issue? And Nietzsche says, well, we have to go into the psychology of those people, because it's ultimately those people who view successful people and also successful civilizations throughout history as being contemptful of them. So we can break this down into the two different ways. On the one hand, we can have the successful individual. And so we can then say, well, what would be wrong with that successful individual? And following this, you could say, well, it would be because they have such and such belongings and are able to create a certain life for themselves. And then Nietzsche would say, well, the people that are going to be critical of those people are going to be those that don't have those given things. And so see those things that they do have as something that's wrong. Just because I don't have a certain car or a certain house, therefore they shouldn't have it either. It's this sort of mentality that Nietzsche is wanting to pick up on here. It's those people who are unsuccessful, who don't have that same drive within them for success, are ultimately those people who are precisely contemptful of those who are successful, because they don't have the same things. And then it goes into the same argument for civilizations. You could say, well, one city can be very contemptful of another because, let's say, within that given city, they've built a fantastic monument to whatever historical event of significance, and therefore the other country can go, well, we don't have that, so neither should you have that either. Why is it fair that you have these things and I don't? It's that sort of mentality. And Nietzsche's critical of it here because he says, well, is it the case that everybody always has that sense of lack of striving for success? No. Why? Because we get the fantastic line out of it all. But who shall call it lust when the height longs to stoop down after power? Truly there is no sickness and lust in such a longing and descent. And to say, well, if a person changes their own mentality from being this contemptful person into wanting to be successful for themselves, that height then will stoop down to then meet their drive for success. And it's all about that striving to be successful for yourself and that mentality change, that therefore it's not something that's just solely exclusive to a set of given people. Everybody within their given field is going to have had to have that strive for success for whatever it is that they do. Let's say it's a musician within a very successful band. Then we can say, well, Of course, we can be very contemptful of how they are, but then it's also saying, well, if you have that same drive and determination for wanting to be successful, like the musician in the band, then you can be also in that position for yourself. And so it's getting out of this mentality of solely thinking that you're not able to do it, because it's precisely the argument of course you can, because you can do it, because they also had to do it for themselves too. So let's move on to the last little discussion for the section on selfishness. So continuing on, oh, who shall find the rightful baptismal and virtuous name for such a longing? Bestowing virtue, that is the name Zarathustra once gave the unnameable. And then it also happened, and truly, it happened for the first time, that his teaching glorified selfishness, the sound, healthy selfishness that issues from a mighty soul. From a mighty soul to which pertains the exalted body, the beautiful, victorious, refreshing body around which everything becomes a mirror. The supple, persuasive body, the dancer whose image and epitome is the self-rejoicing soul. The self-rejoicing of such bodies and souls calls itself virtue. Such self-rejoicing protects itself with its doctrines of good and bad as with sacred groves. With the names it gives its happiness, it banishes from itself all that is contemptible. It banishes from itself all that is cowardly. It says bad, that is to say, cowardly. He who is always worrying, sighing, complaining, and who gleans even the smallest advantage seems contemptible to it, and also despises all woeful wisdom. For truly there is also wisdom that blossoms in darkness, a nightshade wisdom, which is always sighing, all is vain. Timid trustfulness seems base to it, as do all who desire oaths instead of looks and hands, and all too mistrustful wisdom, for such is the nature of cowardly souls. It regards as baser yet him who is quick to please, who, dog-like, lies upon his back, the humble man. And there is also a wisdom that is humble and dog-like and pious and quick to please. Entirely hateful and loathsome to it is he who will never defend himself, who swallows down poisonous spittle and evil looks. The too patient man who puts up with everything is content with everything, for that is the nature of slaves. Whether one be servile before gods and divine kicks, or before men and the silly opinions of men, it spits its slaves of all kinds, this glorious selfishness. Bad, that is what it calls all that is broken down, and niggardly, servile, unclear, blinking eyes, oppressed hearts, and that false, yielding type of man who kisses with broad, cowardly lips. And sham wisdom, that is what it calls all wit that slaves and old men and weary men affect, and especially the whole bad, raving, over-clever priest foolishness, and to ill-use selfishness. Precisely that has been virtue and called virtue, and selfless, that is what, with good reason, all these world-weary cowards and cross-spiders wish to be. But now the day, the transformation, the sword of judgment, the great noontide comes to them all. Then many things shall be revealed, and he who declares the ego healthy and holy and selfishness glorious, truly he, a prophet, declares too what he knows. Behold, it comes, it is near, the great noontide. Thus spoke Zarathustra. And so, following on then from the discussion of lust for power, where we have the whole wanting to strive for success for ourselves, we then have that move into the discussion of selfishness. And we can say, well, what is Nietzsche saying here is that we have to have a healthy selfishness, as he says, and that is a care for ourselves. And so, what does all that mean is that we've got to have a sense of wanting to change our own mentality away from this whole viewing everything as contemptible all the time. And therefore, through this whole wanting to strive for our own success, it's therefore also going to have effect on our knowledge, and not simply being led along by another set of people who are going to tell us what to do and how to think. And what we're going to act like is just a bunch of slaves, as he says, adhering to whatever doctrine that they say, because we've had that sense of care for ourselves, not simply agreeing with whatever's said to us at face value, and therefore we're able to question critically what they're saying, and therefore we don't end up in this very much dog-like, slave-like position, as he says, where we just end up as butt kissers to somebody else. Because what's quite interesting here, it says, unless you take this approach for care for yourself, then you'll be led by someone else for how to think for you. So it's either the question of either you learn to start to think for yourself, or somebody else is going to have done that thought for you. And it's that whole point. Well, you're going to need that care for yourself. Is that selfish? No. Because very much in the way in which you could think of it in terms of you need to care for yourself and your own body, here we can have the same argument to say, well, we also need to care for ourselves in terms of our knowledge as well, and not simply just in the bodily sense at the same time. And so overall for the section, then we could say, well, why is all these things called evil in the first place, and what's going on in the broader sense of the section? It then goes back into the previous section and this whole idea of misanthropy that's set up, in where we have this whole idea of people who hate the world, hate everyone in it, and therefore push everything towards the soul and the afterlife, ultimately telling everybody what to do and how to think. And so within this section, Nietzsche's then confronting an aspect of all this to say, well, the world, when we look at it, is a very positive thing. It's good for us. It gives to us. It gives us things to eat. It gives back. We learn from it. We develop. When it comes to sensual pleasure, sex is a good thing for us. It helps with the procreation of the species. In itself as an act is pleasurable. When we think about also people who are successful, if we have that same mentality, then we could also have that same sense of a drive for success for ourselves, and also lead ourselves to be in a comparable position. And then also having that sense of care for ourselves isn't a negative thing either, because it allows us not to be led astray, gets us out of being led like slaves, led along like dogs, as he says, and therefore we're able to start to think for ourselves. So all incredibly positive things coming out of this section. Many thanks for listening to the episode. Feel free to check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/dissectingphilosophy. Feel free to tip me a coffee at ko-fi.com/dissectingphilosophy. You can also give me a wee question at my email address, dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com. And lastly, I can be found on Twitter at @IamARubberman. Many thanks for listening, and I'll hope you'll join me next time.